Welcome to the Great British Foreign Affairs Podcast, hosting insightful conversations with fascinating people to shape the way that Britain interacts with the world. In this episode, we get under the skin of the US with Ari Ratner, a former State Department official and founder of strategic communications and policy advisory firm Danari Global. Brilliant. So I am extremely happy to have this conversation. I've been wanting to cover the US for a while. And then when we met and started chatting, I knew you were the perfect guest. So, I'd love to just...
I make no promises on that, but very thrilled to be with you.
I'd love you to start by introducing yourself to the listeners, just your background, your connection to the US.
Amazing. Yeah, I'm very, very happy to be with you and very grateful for our friend Peter for introducing us. In terms of my connection to America, you could probably tell I am American. Born in Chicago, but have lived all over the place in the US and now live in London. Professionally, I've had a couple different careers. I was a journalist covering American politics. Then I worked in American politics. I was in the Obama or Hillary Clinton primary campaign in 2007 and the Obama campaign in 2008. And then when we won, I went to government. I was in the State Department mostly, working on a number of things, international economics, Middle East policy. As I like to say, it's not my fault, and speech writing. And ever since, I was at a think tank for a bit, but ever since I've had my own strategic communications firm. So we work with organizations like the UN or the World Bank on their strategic communications around the world. But I'm an amateur student of America. It's obviously a crazy time in American politics and in America's place in the world, as it is a crazy time in the world. So very happy to have the conversation and see if together we can figure out what's going on.
I love it. Let's just firstly just plug in a bit to what you've just described there. I mean, that your whole career sounds fascinating, but that sounds really interesting. The period when you were part of the campaigns, Clinton and Obama campaign, and then in State Department. Tell me a bit about what you took away from that time.
Yeah, it's funny. I studied government before I went into government. And my number one takeaway was that government is unlike anything you read in the books, right? One of my professors in college was Mike McFall, who was later our ambassador to Russia, among many other things. And even when I was a student of his, there's this theory of international relations, the realist theory, where it says that who's in charge of the states doesn't matter. And I remember even at the time, before going into government, we were like, well, that's bunk. That can't possibly be true. But when I saw him one day in the White House, I said, hey, what do you think of the realist theory now? And he said, Ari, whoever came up with that theory has never met Vladimir Putin. So, the academic study of government is very disjointed from the reality of it, certainly in the foreign policy space. And for me, my number one takeaways, I would say 2 or 3 takeaways. One is just, above all else, government itself as an institution is a human institution, right? It's decided at the top by humans. The policy implementing process is human. Therefore, it is very much a let's say, not fault-free process, right? All sorts of things happen for all sorts of reasons, and not necessarily for reasons that make sense or even aren't anything other than comical, even on the most tragic of circumstances. So, that's number one. Number two, certainly from an American perspective now, it's what we like to call the powerlessness of power, right? There's a perception that the Americans are in charge, or 100 years ago that the British are in charge, or this is happening because of a reason. Often that veers into conspiracy theory. But when you're at the top, and I wasn't at the top myself, but I worked for people who were at or near the top. The levers of power, the levers of implementation are quite weak. We don't have great control, certainly over our adversaries. But certainly not over our allies, as you can see all around the world now, and frankly, not even over ourselves. So, it's very much a difficult circumstance in the sense that, what you think ought to happen. There's a very famous saying from American politics that when Eisenhower came in to the White House, Truman said, poor Ike, he's going to say things as president and think things will happen. because when he was general and in charge of, D-Day and the like, things would happen based on what he said. But when you're a president, that's not exactly how it works, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your perspective. And then number three would be, obviously America is itself changing, like all parts of the world are changing, but is going through pretty monumental changes, and America's place in the world is changing. So, it was a very interesting time. We've seen now two presidents in a war. Well, prior to Biden, we had two presidents, Obama and Trump, who, on a foreign policy level, though they could not be more different from each other, were both, big changes from how American foreign policy establishment traditionally ran, at least in the post-Cold War or in the Cold War era and beyond. These were presidents who were coming to grips with a multipolar world in distinct ways. Biden is a bit of a return, but the constraints on American action are increasing, and therefore the creativity of what's possible in the conversation and what our policies are changing from what was a post-Cold War consensus or a post-war consensus to something that's very much wide open.
Yeah, amazing. What takeaways? Yeah. And then you went on to, of course, many other interesting things in your career and interacting with lots of different countries, which I know will now feed into some of what we talk about. I wanted to use this episode, I guess the summary would be to get under the skin of the US. And I say that because, of course, in many situations when I have a guest on talking about a particular country, many of the podcast listeners may not know much about that country, may not have visited. And so we sort of always try to create some aha moments, some description and understanding of a country that someone may not have. And of course, with the US, it's slightly different, but similar in that people think they understand the US, right? And of course, do have a lot of familiarity with it for many reasons, through the media, through interaction, of course, with Americans. But there's always a sense to me that there's more to understand, there's more to peel away. And so we're going to look a little bit, just spend a little bit of time on history, society, culture, aren't we? And then we'll go on to the US, the current political situation in the election year, and the world, US and the world, and finally look at UK and the US.
Sounds good.
It's like a Woodstock tour.
All the easy topics,
All the easy topics, peeling the layers of the onion back. Let's start with history. I know that you started explaining to me some really interesting thoughts about how does understanding US history help us understand the country that it is today?
Yeah, it's very funny. I mean, look, I'm a big believer in the importance of history of any country, and the U.S. in terms of a British perspective, in terms of a world perspective, has a relatively short history as a modern country. The thing I usually like to say about America is, classically, when you would talk about the American experience, you usually start by dating it to 1776, the Revolution, or perhaps you start by dating it to the colonial era. And there's obviously particular ties with England, in particular, but other colonial powers. Or if you want to be really grandiose about it, you'll talk about Greece and Rome and the legacy of the West and democracy and all that. But I like to say, look, the most important thing to understand about America is that we fought a civil war. It wasn't that long ago, and in some respects, it never really ended. Now, obviously, the Civil War itself ended and slavery is long gone, thank God. But many of the issues that America faced in the Civil War, and that even before the Civil War characterized America, how to govern a space that is so large. That's a continental space. What is the role of the states versus the federal government? What is the role, obviously regionally, north and south, but also between the cities and the rural part of the society, between industrial, which was the north, and the south, which was agricultural mostly. Obviously the issues of race relations, a number of those issues, church and state, still factor into America, still are quite contentious and still are quite diverse. I mean, the classic thing is, of course, many of your viewers, I'm sure, will have been to America, and the Americans have a way of visiting those who even haven't gone. Whether that's, I don't mean that in an Iraq sense, of course, although that, is an experience of some countries. But whether it's American media, American tourists, American travelers, That is, of course, a sort of feature of not just England, although the relationship is quite close, but of the modern world in many respects, in all countries. But America is diverse, and usually people are encountering. Certainly the Europeans are usually encountering the coasts, right? They're usually encountering, New York and California, or outposts of the coasts in other parts of the country. And that's, of course, a very big part of America. But, there's lots and lots of other parts of America. And look, a lot of it would be quite similar to England. The same basic political divide. Well, there's many different political divides here and there, but one of the big political divides, right? Trump supporters are in many respects the same supporters, or the bedrock of it is the people who voted for Brexit, right? The northern towns and the Midland towns that lost their jobs in globalization and in the opening of China are in many respects similar to the Great Lakes region in the Midwest of the U.S., right? These were bedrocks of the Democratic Party or the Labor Party that have now become very wide open. They're playing out in different circumstance, but and that's not distinct to England and America either, right? That's like the Ruhr Valley in Germany, or the industrial heartland of what was the industrial heartland of France, northern Italy, and on and on. So some of what is happening in America, of course, is unique to America, and some is quite similar to what's going on in Europe. But I think, to me, the biggest difference, and again, it's an obvious thing to say, but the implications are quite strong, is the sheer size of the country. I'm from Illinois. Illinois, I'm sure, is larger in surface area than Britain. And Illinois is not a particularly large state. It's a kind of mid-sized state. And that affects people's mentality, their ability to travel, their ability to enter the world. That affects the security situation in America profoundly, and has, a huge effect on the psychology of the country in many respects.
Yeah, I think the ongoing reminder of how big America is so important for Europe, which has so many smaller countries. In terms of the psychology, I was interested in your take on American society. What do you think it's easy to miss for people outside of the US?
Yeah, like any country, right? People have their stereotypes of America, and their stereotypes depend, who they are and their experience of America. But the situation is always more complicated. So let me take an example: healthcare, right? Healthcare in America, like in all countries, has its serious challenges. It's a distinct challenge than the healthcare system here, of course. But you'll hear people say, "Well, in America, it's a private healthcare system, and in England, it's a public healthcare system." America has a huge public healthcare system, right? There's several of them. Medicare, which is for everyone in the country over 65. They have Medicaid, which is for anyone who can't afford medical care. And then the federal government, the Army, they also have their own healthcare. If you add up Medicare plus Medicaid plus the federal government, our public health system is bigger than the NHS. Right, covers more people than the NHS covers. So America, of course, has a fractured healthcare system, has a huge private system. Of course, England has a private system as well, but a bigger one. But the public healthcare system alone is massive, right? So the arguments don't always reflect the complexity underneath, and that's true on many different issues, right? You look at something like guns, which is another kind of exceptional American thing, and in many respects, America really is an exceptional country in terms of guns, access to guns, violence with guns. But of course, that's a deeply, deeply polarizing issue in the country. And it's a deeply, deeply contentious issue, and it's an issue under which there is quite a lot of consensus, and it's difficult to get done. The one other thing I'd say in terms of government that's distinct from England or distinct from Britain, and any parliamentary system is the way the government is set up, which has an effect on the culture, but especially in public policy. The way the government is set up in America, which is a legacy from the revolution, it makes it very difficult to do things, even more difficult than it is here. Right? By dint of being prime minister, you have a majority in parliament, or a coalition with a majority in parliament. The American government is usually divided. So it's even when we were in government, you'd often, people will say something like Washington wants to do something, or the White House wants to do something, or the Hill, which is our Congress, wants to do something. And your first question is, well, who? at the White House, or who in Washington, or which office in the Hill, right? Because as soon as you dive in, it's a Game of Thrones like panoply of people, all with different interests, environments, and priorities. So you kind of always have to dive in.
Yeah, I hear you. To sort of round off that bit, I guess it always strikes me when you hear people talk about British and American culture, that when people start, for example, working together or when they emigrate for work, they think that they're going to the same culture. And at the beginning, it seems like they are. And then as they get further and further into it, they discover more and more differences. You're much more qualified to tell me about this than I am, but I am interested in the cultural differences that exist that are useful to remind ourselves of.
Yeah, no, it's funny, and I'm by no means an expert on this. I think people, humorists especially, have written whole books on this. I think it's George Bernard Shaw who famously said the Americans and the English are two people separated by a common language. That there's quite a lot that's similar, right? If you were to line up two countries, I mean, probably for America, Canada would be the closest country, but England or maybe Australia would be next closest. So there's lots of similarity, but there's lots of difference. And of course, there's huge perception gaps, right? I mean, the classic. There's a great meme going around that's American perceptions of the English, and it's like Downton Abbey. It's people in tuxedos and ball gowns, and continental European perceptions of the English, and it's soccer hooligans, right? Americans, by dint of the accent, at least a sort of London accent or an upper crust accent, we automatically assume you're smart. I think people automatically assume I'm dumb. That's one big difference. If I'm blunt. I mean, for me, there's huge, and there's obviously tons of. My wife and I every day come up with a new word difference that we didn't know existed. My favorite recent one was we call a side mirror. I think you guys call a wing mirror. But there's all sorts of silly things. To me, in many respects, one thing to say is probably the difference within each country is as great or bigger than the difference between each country, and there's counterparts, right? London is a lot like New York. London and New York are probably more similar than two other big international cities out there. But apart across the countries, I think again by dint of the size and by dint of the end of the empire on the English side, the sense of possibility in America, and this is stereotypical, but I think also true, tends to be bigger, right? The sort of entrepreneurial spirit, the Silicon Valley kind of thing is bigger, but also just sort of in policy circles, the outlook, just because America is now a global power and Britain is de facto a former global power, to me strikes as different. I don't know how much that reflects the day-to-day culture. I mean, I think the day-to-day culture of London is indeed a global city, but I think it affects a lot of the business culture and the political culture. And then, I think we're famously more loud and brash.
That's very interesting about the entrepreneurial and innovation. Yeah, the spirit of that, but also the business environment. It's interesting that you link that actually to the history, because I think you're absolutely right that that's something that Britain, I think, can continue to really learn and continue to try and absorb from American counterparts in those sectors and those industries. I'm thinking that we had a podcast episode actually on AI and on technology, and the UK, the US and China are obviously way ahead, but the UK is actually the third country in ranking for innovation. And so it's still very much, that's part of who Britain is and wants to be, and it's part of what it can offer to the world. But there's a lot that it can be learning from the American commitment to that.
Yeah, and look, I mean, right, if we're honest, right, that's deeply part of British culture. I mean, the Industrial Revolution came out of England. Modern democracy in many respects came out of England. Obviously, a whole rank of culture. So it's nothing in any sense alien to English or British culture by any stretch. But I literally ran into an American friend of mine who's also married to a Brit at the subway the other day, at the tube the other day, and we were talking about it. We were talking about some particular philanthropic idea that a friend of hers had, and she was like, "Think bigger," and we were joking. Yeah. They don't. The first instinct isn't to think. And I don't know if this is true. This is limited action, but the first because the market is smaller, and because the country is smaller, right? The thought size tends to be smaller, I think. And I know a lot of this played up in where America has a very much of a sense of also of what's its place in the world, but it's not sort of a daily question in the same sense of especially because of Brexit. What is England's place in the world, and what is England's place on this island within Europe and globally, and that's all sort of up for debate, and there's many levels to it. And America, it's just sort of taken for granted, I think, sometimes very badly, that we're, and I don't think often reflects the truth, but that we're number one is a sort of de facto, or we're the biggest, or our ideas will go everywhere. It's just sort of, baked in, and that's got some advantages and some real disadvantages too.
Think bigger. I love that. Just finishing off on this, almost looking back and looking in, UK and US history, just quickly highlight for us what the British people should be remembering or understanding at a very high level about American history and how it links to British history, because we are terrible at learning this in our school system, and it's important as we're adults, we keep reminding ourselves.
It's funny. I mean, my wife and I joke because we said, we were living in America for a year before, and I said something about the Revolution. And she said she didn't know much about it. Oh, we went to Hamilton, and she said she didn't know anything about Hamilton. I said, of course you don't know anything about Hamilton because he's not an obscure figure, but until the musical wasn't a very famous figure. But I said, Shirley knows something about Washington. And she didn't know much, and I went, well, didn't you cover a bit of it in school? And she said no. And then she said, we basically went from 1066 to 1940 with a bit of a stop in Henry VIII.
In Victorian.
And America, America's similar, right? Like we skip over. I mean, our history is notoriously poorly taught. Obviously, the relationship between the UK and the US plays a phenomenally important role in American history on at least a number of levels. There's a whole colonial history. The old joke is, of course, that the Australians are your convicts and the Americans are your religious dissidents. So, and even the colonial history with England is quite varied, right? Jamestown, which is the first British colony in America, is not founded for religious reasons, founded to farm tobacco. But the Puritans came in 1620 and again in 1630. Very profound who they were, where they came out of within the British landscape. The role in the English Civil War, all of that plays a very profound role in the American colonial system, which continues on today. Obviously, the revolution against England, plays a very particular important role. But that period of confrontation with England was relatively short, right? It was 1770. Early 1770s, 1776 to 1812, basically, and then a sort of intermediate period in the relationship where America was expanding westward. The Civil War happened, where the relationship with England was sort of up for grabs. Unclear if the British were going to intervene in the American Civil War. That played a very important role in both Southern and Northern strategy in the American Civil War. And then really the kind of fast-paced growth of America, which was to some extent fueled by British capital. And then, of course, the last 100 years with the First World War and the Second World War. So, I think there's probably two things to say, which is one, like English history, just a little shorter, if you take aside the pre-Columbian context, there's huge waves of American history, right? And the colonial era is, of course, different from the Revolutionary era, different from the Civil War era, different from industrialization, and on and on. No different than the, Victorians or the Anglo-Saxon era earlier, and you can kind of peel back, and there's certain things that carry over, including from the British, Anglo-Saxon period into America. The importance of courts, right? Very British thing becomes very important, even more so in many respects in America. And there's certain things that are really distinct. And the relationship with America and England evolve and in many respects flip. I mean, I think if you think in a foreign policy level, one thing that's certainly benefited modern Britain is, when England or when Britain went from a great power status, it largely passed to us. You've sort of lived, under the American security umbrella in one respect or another for the last 100 years, or even a little longer. And we have a very similar global posture. I mean, a very different kind of empire, but basically we play the role of offshore balancers, right? We don't want, either Europe or Asia to be consolidated by one power that's hostile to us. So, that's sort of British grand strategy as well through most, at least in Europe. So in some respects, England, had this ability to have that tradition take on by America, who sort of police the world in a way that's broadly favorable to England. Obviously, involved the dissolution of the empire. There's a question of what comes next. I mean, might be a multipolar world, might be China, might be whatever, but there isn't for America a country that is, a little bit, carbon copy of it to take over and police it in a way that is broadly favorable to America. So that, looking forward is a real challenge. And I think what comes next is, to some extent, looks like what was before 1914, right? A very multipolar world, not one that's like, now we hand it to Australia, right? Very similar country with very similar values and very similar interests in the grand scheme of things, and they'll look after us. I don't think anyone in the English establishment would like me saying that, the Americans look after, the Brits. But if we're honest about it, I mean, that's sort of how the world has functioned, at least in the Cold War and beyond. And now that's changing too, right? Because the sort of American consensus on foreign policy is up for grabs as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting and takes us perfectly to where I want us to get to, which is talking about the US and its role in the world, how it sees the world and the UK within that. But I feel like we need to talk about the US election before we get to that.
Everyone's favorite topic, right? Yeah.
Because there are different versions, of course, of the future. Just catch us up with what's going on right now. I mean, we're in June. This may go out in July, but where are we right now in terms of the election campaigning and politics in the US?
Yeah, it's funny. I like to say American politics is a little bit like World War I now, and British politics a little bit like World War II. What I mean by that is American politics is basically a long war of attrition. All right, I can't tell you who's going to win. I can tell you it's going to be very close and very ugly. Right, and it's been going on for many months, and will go on at least until November, which is when the election is, and possibly beyond. Right, and that's how American campaigns are long. The country has had since 2000 basically a series of extremely close elections. The Obama 2008, it was the only one that was really a landslide in any respect, and even that was relatively close. If we're talking now, both Biden and Trump are deeply unpopular. I mean, they're at the highest of unpopularity of any two major candidates that we've seen. I think they've even surpassed Trump and Clinton, which were deeply unpopular in their own right. And it's largely a negative campaign. Somewhat to animate your base against the other side. British politics is a bit more like World War World War II, right? It's a fast moving, big swings, right? I don't know exactly what's going to happen here, but pretty clear Labour are going to win. It's going to be a huge shift, right? And then people are going to hang out, and then there'll be another big shift. Continental politics in general is having these huge shifts, and you don't really see that in America as much, in part because the country is so polarized. I think that is, by the way, another cultural difference between here, where there's obviously big differences between London and the countryside, and there's big political differences, but the political cultural divide strikes me as not as intense here. Everything in America, not everything, but most everything is a culture war issue. We've gotten to the point where you practically have Democratic and Republican toothpaste, right? Or I can very easily, if you tell me where you shop for groceries or what kind of food you eat, I'm very likely to know how you vote, right? That is a very, sort of distinctly, same with what neighborhood you're in, same with what age. A lot of that, a bit of that is shifting because Trump has thrown open the landscape, and that's held somewhat steady despite the upheaval with Trump, over the last 20 years. So it's really politically a divided country, and it plays out. The election itself plays out through a very antiquated, weird system, right? We have this electoral college, which sometimes produces a winner who's not the winner in any normal sense. That's happened twice this century. Bush versus Gore, and then Clinton versus Trump. It's going to be close. The courts are going to play a role. Who the VP is, which normally doesn't matter that much, may play a big role because both of them are so unpopular and so old. So it's really going to be an interesting, time. And I think people are, if we're honest, people are already sick of it, and they're going to get more and more sick of it because the campaigning is really only beginning.
Yeah, thank you. So that's a really useful summary of where the election is at. Is there anything in addition domestically that you think is important for people to know about what the US is currently focused on internally?
Yeah, U.S. elections largely don't revolve around foreign policy, to be clear, right? The most important issue in the election is, like it's been for a number of elections in a row, is the economy. Perhaps the only recent election where that wasn't the case might have been 2004, because it was soon after September 11th. So a few things to say, right? Like if you line up when you ask people, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but usually the people things say are kind of bread and butter issues. The economy, inflation, healthcare are very often at the top. The next things, which are also very important, also play a big role here, are immigration, crime. Right, those are both quality of life issues for people, economic issues in some respect, but also quite cultural issues. Right? You have the same, sort of thing going on in America. Those are huge issues. Inflation, which has risen, of course, and then foreign policy. Now, foreign policy, often sets a mood music for a lot of things, right? Biden's numbers never really recovered from, the quick withdrawal from Afghanistan, right? So they color a lot. I mean, the war in the Middle East colors a lot, and has for particular constituencies, relatively small constituencies, but important ones: Jews, Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, and progressives. May play a very big role, and frankly, evangelicals too. The things that are, but all of those are, big issues in British politics too. I think the things that aren't big issues in British politics, the issue of abortion, right? Trump, frankly, in some respects, stole at least one and probably two. I'm speaking as a Democrat, but they may take credit in stealing two Supreme Court justices, right, and overturned Roe v. Wade, which enshrined in law the right to access to an abortion. Right, that is now thrown open American politics in a lot of respects. And if you look at the midterms, right, where the Republicans should have done better than they did on the kind of traditional issues, crime, well, even before crime, economy, inflation, they did worse than they were expected, in large part because of women voters, right? So the big swing constituencies in American politics, I mean, there's a number, but probably the single biggest one are sort of soccer moms, suburban women, who are huge voting bloc, and they tend to be, quite pragmatic on a number of issues, and they tend to be up for grabs, and they don't like, if, in large part, even if they personally, morally feel opposed to abortion or want some restrictions, they don't like the level of degree to which that has been thrown open, and even to the point where there's now debates in the U.S. about IVF. I mean, the Republican Senate had to come out the other day and say they were for IVF after a court ruled against it. So, that is a real big X factor in the American elections that doesn't exist in British politics, at least to any degree like it, and one that largely is now favoring the Democrats because they're more animated about it. Their voters are more fired up about it, and then, maybe it's helpful, because the coalitions in America are similar but also distinct than exist in British politics. And obviously there's certain quirks in British politics that don't exist in American politics. We have nothing like the SNP, right? There's no, there's no Sinn Féin, there's no Northern Ireland. So take aside that, but even within England, the coalitions, which are stable but evolving, right? The Democratic coalition is really a coalition among the cities, right? Educated whites and progressives, and then minorities. First and foremost, African Americans, the single most democratic group in the country, but also Hispanics, also Asian Americans in many respects. Democratic coalition tends to be younger, tends to be more female, more women based. More urban, more educated. Old Democratic constituency was sort of white working class industrial workers. Now they've shifted over, right? If you look at the Republican coalition, tends to be older, tends to be more rural, tends to be more conservative. Obviously tends to be more religious, aside from the African Americans, right? The more religious you are, the more Republican you are. More male, more patriotic, more military, right? And the battlegrounds, right, are the suburbs in many respects. The suburban women, often who their husbands are often Republican, so that's an interesting feature, and not to stereotype, but that's sort of the stereotype, and it often rooted in the reality. And that's sort of playing out this election. I think the other thing playing out of this election is Trump is doing surprisingly well, still losing by big margins, but doing much better among Hispanics and Asians than traditional, even much better among blacks, particularly black men, and is doing better among young men. 10 years ago, young men and women, youth was overwhelmingly a Democratic issue. Now young women are overwhelmingly Democratic. Young men are much more open, much more up for grabs. I mean, there's all sorts of think pieces about why. Is it Me Too? Is it, well, largely it is that. Is it Me Too, or is it something in the culture? Or is it men falling behind? And there's a huge gender gap in politics and in society that's opened up in the States. I don't know if it exists here. If you look at college graduates, which is another big indicator of Democratic voting, something like 55% of college students in America now are women. So that gap that's opened up is something new, and Trump is getting a lot of support among younger men that you wouldn't have seen 10 years ago. So that's sort of where the change is in many respects.
Yeah. And then coming on to how the US sees the world, I'm interested how you would sum that up. But also I think you mentioned before, you said US foreign policy is kind of up for grabs at the moment, or it's not necessarily clear what's going to happen as it moves forward. So interested in your thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's a very interesting issue, and foreign policy, I would very much divide between elite opinion and sort of popular opinion. It plays a big role in both, but foreign policy is largely an elite policy making space, and has been for a long time in the U.S. If you look at that elite space, we'll come back to the popular in a second, but if you look at that elite space, following 1945, really following 1941, until at least 1991, and probably until which is the end of the Cold War, and at least probably until 2003, right? There was a very heavy consensus on how things were done. There was a disruption around Vietnam, which is a big thing. I don't want to play that down. But, if I told you a senator's foreign policy position, you couldn't immediately tell me that person's Democratic or that person's Republican, because they'd be pretty much the same. This was an old time in Washington where the saying was the politics stopped at the water's edge. Right. So there was very much a consensus of America's role in the world. Kennedy probably said it best, right? We will defend any friend, oppose any foe, bear any burden. I'm mangling his speech, but that's all a Democratic. The Cold War really lessened divides. Now, if you look prior to World War II, right, a lot of the divides that are happening now in American politics, isolationism versus internationalism, those are long-standing issues in American policy, but they went away in the Cold War and its immediate after effect, and they're reemerging, right? So Trump is, in many respects, an isolationist in American politics. He's a little bit different than that, but that was a huge position in America between the wars, before the First World War. I mean, that was probably a dominant position before Pearl Harbor, or at least before the fall of France. Right, all of a sudden that position is reemerging. Right, and the message that's going to people is, if I'm blunt about it and excuse the language, is the elites screwed you. Right, by opening the the trade with China, by trade with Mexico, you've been harmed, right? And that's not unique to Trump. I mean, when I was a kid, Ross Perot ran, and as a third party. One of the things he ran against was NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, our sort of small version of the EU, right? And he said that NAFTA was going to create a giant sucking sound of jobs. And a lot of the jobs that have been lost in the industrial base have been lost to technology. They've probably more been lost to China than they've been lost to Mexico. But that's stuck with people, and that issue has really reemerged. And you've gone from a place in America where 20, 30 years ago, sort of the quote unquote average American thought that things were going well to things that aren't going well. I've been harmed. My position has fallen behind. And a sense that America's fallen behind. And there's a lot of causes for that, right? I mean, it's quite a complex story. I mean, if you look at it just on, from between when the Berlin Wall falls to 9/11, right? From an American perspective, some terrible things happen. Rwanda, there's several things, but it's a very, very stable world and very, very moving in America's direction. And then you had in succession 9/11, the Iraq War, the financial crisis, Trump, COVID, right? Trump's an internal thing, but the world is just more shaken. People don't know what to make of it in the same way. And rise of other powers, China most importantly, right? So that's really popular. On the elite level, there's a whole question of what to do with it, right? And the divides now are quite big. Turn inwards, really go outwards. Be more ally based, right? Biden is in many respects a figure from the consensus, from the Cold War consensus. That's sort of how he grew up in Washington, although he was always a bit of a maverick. So his policy is largely sort of classically American Cold War policy. But what comes next is up for grabs. I mean, you could imagine a Trump presidency where the Americans pull out of NATO. Right? You can imagine a Trump presidency where we don't pull out of NATO. You can imagine a war with China very easily. We're already in at least American allies are already in major wars in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, right? All of those are relatively new things, and it's sort of shaken what we understood about the world and our place in the world in really profound ways, and left up huge policy choices.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because there are a lot of similarities with the UK, but the response is quite different in terms of the country's position in the world. What do you think? How is the US seeing Europe?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, the number one thing, this is another big shift that people I don't think talk about as well, which is, especially in the Cold War era, but even before, America, by dint of history and cultural affinity, was largely an Atlanticist power, even as we were a Pacific power, right? We were a Pacific and Atlantic power. We fought, as did England, but we fought two wars, right? The Japan War and the German War. But for us, they were closer to equal wars. One wasn't an afterthought in the same way, and we faced both oceans directly. Which Britain in the colonial era did, but doesn't now, obviously. So the shift from America is really an Atlantic power at heart to a more global power, where the major threat is at least one of the major threats is China, right? It's a feature that animates even European politics, but America is much less focused on. And what I'm saying in essence is America is much less focused on Europe than it used to be, even with the Ukraine war. The focus on NATO, the focus on Europe. I mean, NATO for 20, 30 years, we haven't quite known what to do with it ourselves, and maybe it's sort of come back in some respects. But the issue of China, the issue of the Middle East, of course, it is especially among the elite, right? The military planners, right? It's a major focus. And it's the sort of some of the technological issues we've talked about too. It's a really significant way of thinking about the world, and Europe falls behind a little bit in that respect. I mean, it's kind of, I think Tony Blair actually gave a great speech in Congress, where he talked about how close America and England were, and he was basically saying we'd love to be just worry about America, but we're 27 miles off, or whatever it is, 22 miles off the coast of France, right? We are also present in Europe, obviously, but it's not the same proximity, and therefore it's a bit of a division. I think is opening up. I mean, the other thing to say is, of course, right, if you think of American grand strategy, and I can paint really bad versions of American grand strategy, but American grand strategy classically, at least since the Second World War, has been, prevent a rise of a challenging power in Europe and in Asia that can threaten us in the same way that Germany and Japan did. And militarily, it's been to have the ability to fight two wars in those two theaters simultaneously, or sometimes it got lessened to fight in one and hold in the other. Right. And all of a sudden you can imagine, if you look at the world, and I don't mean this in an axis of evil way, you could imagine the Second World War being fought now, except instead of having Japan and Germany as allies, as enemies, they're now allies, and now we face the Russians and the Chinese, which are much bigger states than Japan and Germany, right? So the challenge is, and then you have a similar thing in the Middle East with Iran, which is a bit more of a question. But the sort of landscape, even the conversation I'm having, about World War III again, on a non-nuclear sense, right, is a new or renewed conversation you wouldn't have had 20 years ago. So that's a big change, and then I think we face the same things that everyone faces, right? If you look at I went to Stanford for undergraduate, and one of my professors was Condoleezza Rice, right? And if I took the syllabus we had in her Intro to Foreign Policy course, right, it flowed, from the great powers, and then we looked at, great power politics, then we looked at regional powers, then we looked at, sort of unconventional things. This was pre 9/11, terrorism, pandemics, technology, things that were tacked on at the end because they were important, and one day somewhere something like that may happen. Right now, all of a sudden you look at that and they're all live issues. Right, until the Ukraine war, you could have even flipped the syllabus on its head, where all of a sudden the pandemic and terrorism and economics became the number one issue, and then you had to deal with this. And now we're in a world where you have to deal with it all simultaneously. You always had to, but there was clear rankings. Now we're in the situation where you've got hot regional wars, hot great power, or cold great power conflict, an after effect of a pandemic, the ever-present, worry of terrorism, technological challenges, and everyone looks at the, what we're doing, drone warfare, and what does that do to the American carriers and the like. So, even as I'm saying it, it's sort of exhausting, but the issue set is become really expansive, to put it mildly.
It's a great description of it. We've talked a lot in this podcast with various emerging markets, middle powers, as such, countries that have young, ambitious populations, and they're really finding their space, or have found their space and agency in the world, and are pushing forwards. And there's quite a difference between how populations feel in those countries versus perhaps some of the issues that you've talked about, the US populations and UK communities struggling with. How do you think the US is looking at those countries that are more pivot countries, or swing countries, they're sometimes called, essentially what has previously been called the rest of the world, sometimes in Western dialogue, and yet, can no longer be seen like that?
Yeah, and look, I mean, there's a lot of approaches to, sort of the rest of the world, right? Including, largely speaking, America tries to maintain, like all countries, very positive relations. Right. And we, like England, in many respects, are benefited from having diasporas from almost all parts of the world. So oftentimes with any country, right, when I worked at the State Department, if, the Secretary of State or another senior official is going, name your country, India. Well, that's a big country, but, Bhutan, Ghana, right? We talk to the, immigrants from, or, descendants of immigrants from those countries, right? So we have ties with all countries, and often those ties are very rich, and they range from cultural ties to economic ties to security ties, and the like. and I think there's a broad way of looking at them, right? One is like any other country, we want to have a positive relationship on its own merits, and a mutually productive relationship. Obviously, those countries now get caught up in the regional power struggles within those societies. So if you take a country like, regions. So if you take a country like Vietnam or Indonesia or really any other country in Asia you can think of, right? We have a bilateral relationship, and the issue of China is a part of that, right? And oftentimes those countries are in their own right worried about their security position. And, you'd have the same thing, in the Middle East in regards to Iran or any other regional power. So, I think in general, we try and, have a relationship that stands on its own two legs. But of course, those countries are factored into sort of the great power dynamics. And look, it's also true, I think, and you work on Africa a lot more than I do, right? If you think of the world, 50 years from now, Africa is the fastest growing population center in the world. Africa's very fast growing economies, has particular challenges, has shared challenges like climate and the rest that we all face. So, how do we have a relationship? I worked in the Obama administration. The relationship with Africa was complicated and benefited. We had a president who was, his father came from Kenya, right? That was a major subtext, let's say, of our policy. So we obviously have a very, very close and connected and largely drawn into American politics in terms of immigration and other issues, relationship with Latin America. That's very, very important in American policy. So, all of these are very serious issues. And you're right that we ignored them to some extent because they tend to be issues that don't occupy the front pages of the paper, but they will always occupy an economist, spread in 10 years of what's one of the biggest transitions that's happened in the world. And just one other divide, because we talked about American politics that came up since. I think one other big divide in American politics is climate change, right? Unlike in most of Europe, although maybe with the far right parties, climate change is still a fairly active issue in American politics on the level of, to the extent to which it's true or human caused or its relationship. And you see that play out in foreign policy, right? So I think Jake Sullivan, who's the American National Security Advisor, had a statement a while ago saying, our foreign policy to some extent revolves around climate change, right? A Republican would never say that. The energy politics, it has a very clear left, right, and divide in American politics, but also in American foreign policy. And that's sort of important to note. And you see big changes of that in another Biden administration or a Trump administration.
Yeah.
And it's a big factor in how we relate to the world, right? The conversations we'll have, and especially those type of countries, but even with China, right? We'll be on climate change. We'll be very much affected by that.
Yeah, that's a really important thing for particularly Europeans to remember, I think, because it's easy to assume that the debate is similar to the European context, or at least is developing strongly in that direction. So just circling back in then to the UK-US relationship, we've already touched on it a little bit, but in terms of your insights, what would be your strategic advice then for a new UK government after these elections coming up in the UK in how best to approach the US and what it should be trying to achieve in its relationship?
In terms of looking forward, it's a really interesting question how I would approach America as a British policymaker, because I think from the American standpoint, it's largely neglected. It's not neglected in the sense of it's disdained. I mean, it's just taken for granted in a positive sense. I mean, I'd say the same thing about a relationship with Canada, right? It's sort of just assumed we're going to have good relations with Canada. Trudeau became a bit of an American political football in some respects. In a way that maybe Boris Johnson a little bit or Corbyn a little bit, but Starmer won't be like that, right? No one is going to make a big deal of him because we don't know him. He's sort of clearly deliberating a sort of mainstream appeal. He's not going to be a political football unless he, does something crazy or accidental. And the obvious thing is, of course, don't say anything until the American election, because the world you exist in it might be very different. But of course, that's also not helpful. And the American election is, of course, not just the presidential election. There's many other elections happening in the fall. For us, I think, if I'm looking at this from an English perspective, and correct me if I'm wrong, right? The world looks a bit different, in the sense that, you know, English prosperity, English economy depends on either Europe or America, much more than the American economy depends on England or even on Europe. Right? By dint of our size again and our geography and the size of the economy, right? It is very good idea for us to have good relations with all those countries. I mean, those are huge markets. We have very strong security ties. I'm a big Anglophile personally, and big Atlanticist. Believe in that, but it's not core to the strategy. Even the security strategy, where it is core, it's a bit secondary, right? If I'm looking at the world as England, or as Britain, right? I now have to deal in a world where my security situation is worse than it was, and the Americans can't be counted on to quite the same extent, right? Especially if it's Trump. What happens to NATO all of a sudden is a real question. So you've got a security problem. We do too, but more direct. And you have an economic problem that we don't have to quite the same extent, right? Your natural trading partners, for good or bad, you shut off or created a barrier, or want to create a barrier, or you want a global trading environment. Good, right? We're one of your natural partners. We're a big partner. We have others, right? China, Japan, the rest of the world, this week, which are huge markets. But you're in the unfortunate position of having to cultivate us a little bit more than we have to cultivate you, particularly on the economic front, right? So part of what I want to say, and now I'm speaking personally as an American who just moved here, right? And God knows how many Americans, I'd be curious to know the numbers, but hundreds of thousands of Americans must be in Britain at any one time, living, studying, working. And in some respects, you make it quite easy for us, right? The visa system is much easier than the American visa system. We just tried to get my wife an American visa, which she's entitled to. Nightmare. Here, very easy. But basic things like opening a bank account as a business owner in England as a very hard. Getting insurance, very hard. Getting a credit card, and I have American credit, right? None of this will matter to the average English voter, and it won't matter to the average American. But now you have a very important group of Americans with close ties, or who live in England, or who want to live in England, or who'd love to spend 2 years in London. Right now, you have to think through all sorts of things that I'm sure some people are thinking about. But what's our visa policy to get those young achievers, right? You have this policy of grads from the Ivy Leagues can come, which is, and I went to Ivy Leagues for both of my schools. I think a stupid way of looking at the world, but attracting entrepreneurs, highly educated people. That's a real important thing all of a sudden, in a way that we don't think about in the same way, because we're like, oh, well, we can get them from England, and we can get them from Germany, and we can get them from the best and the brightest from Ghana want to come to America too. They may want to come to England as well, but we just don't. We probably should think about it in the same way, but we don't. So some of this is looking at this sort of nitty gritty of how do I leverage the American relationship, which is a really profound relationship, to develop the English economy. And there ought to be, and I'm sure there is, but all sorts of ways of thinking through that for investors, for creatives, for students. Of course, there's a lot. That's the first thing I would say, because the brand of England in America is very, very powerful. Still, I mean, I joked about it with, we sort of think you guys are all in tuxedos and ball gowns, but, or we think the accent is smart, but there's a lot of Americans who want to live here, should live here, do live here, and the like. And I'm not certain the country as a whole is taking as good advantage of that as it could. That's one thing to say. I think on a more foreign policy level, the number one issue is, I think, what do you do with NATO, particularly if there's a Trump thing? How do you keep NATO together? And Trump, in some respects, his criticism of NATO is not so distinct from any other American president and this doesn't apply to England, but applies to Germany or France or Italy. We pay more. We pay more for our defense, or your defense. So how do you not only work as a country, but with your partners in Europe to increase defense spending, is a massive issue, and it's a massive issue, particularly while the war in Ukraine is going on. But beyond, and then of course, there's the rest of the world, right? You face strategic choices like every country faces. How I think, and certain countries face it much more than you. Australia, for instance, right? How do you grow with China without being threatened by China, or dictated by China? England faces a version of that, right? What policy do you pursue in the Middle East, right? Right now, you're largely following the Americans, which from an American perspective is great. Um, from an English perspective, I don't know. I mean, you could have a huge debate, right? Labor has said they're going to recognize a Palestinian state, right? The American president is almost certainly not going to do that, at least in the foreseeable future, absent negotiations towards that. Is that going to open up some massive split with the Americans? No. Or maybe on this particular issue, it's not going to crush the relationship by any stretch, but you have a choice there. And that's a choice that every European or other power is going to face, right? The Germans are going to face a very similar kind of thing. So all of that is tough. I think you're operating in a very good bandwidth where the goodwill between the two countries is almost taken for granted. It's so strong. Even Trump, who sort of is notoriously fickle, and crazy, even he has a golf course in Scotland, so you're like, he's not going to do something crazy in this respect. Whereas if you're like, another close American ally, or a borderline American ally, right? If you're Estonia or Lithuania or Poland, right, you have to go, okay, what is he going to do? The notion of that in the English context is still, very constrained. Um, but yeah, I mean, the other thing I'd say is, the last thing I'd say is, um, you know, I don't think the English policymakers, to my mind, have really addressed the American public in any visible way that I can think of since Blair. I'm sure that's not true. I'm sure May gave a speech and Johnson gave a speech, and Cameron, I'm sure, gave many speeches in America. But England has been largely consumed internally, and so is America to some extent. But it's hard to think of an English prime minister that has made the effort that Blair, and not just Blair, prior to Blair, Thatcher, obviously Churchill in the extreme, towards cultivating the Americans, right? The notion of special relationship comes from his speech in Fulton, Missouri, of all places. So, I wouldn't, and it's a privileged position for me to take it because we often take you for granted, but I wouldn't take us for granted in the same way. Right? Your biggest source of news in America about England is probably Prince Harry right now, right? That's not the strategic position you want to be in. So how to think that through and what the message is. Particularly, I mean, American politics and British politics, famously often move together, right? You have Thatcher and Reagan, and you have Clinton and Blair, and now you're going to be in a position you might be something like that, but the contrast could be as stark as between Trump and Starmer. And regardless, I don't think Biden, I'm sure he's met Starmer by this point, but I don't think he has the same personal relationship that we would have had with, many of the other English leaders. So both on the elite level, but on the public level of, really thinking through what's the strategy. And, I think on the, Lammy, if I'm not mistaken, studied in America. Everyone will know America well, but bridging that divide also. And the last thing I'll say is, right, like, how do you connect England and America beyond London and New York, or beyond LA and New York, or frankly, from an English perspective, beyond London, and from an American perspective, beyond the other big cities, is a huge area, right? There's military to military ties, but I don't know what the Midlands to Midlands program is, or the, Ohio to London program. My sense is all of that's been neglected, and that most of the infrastructure on the relationship was set up in the immediate aftermath of the war for a Cold War era, and no one has really taken the time, in part because it was in smooth operating mode, to update it or to think through on a real level. And it's been largely elite, with huge public things, because of media, because of culture, because of vacations and the like. I mean, there's a huge, obviously, public to public tie, but that's operated outside of strategy. I think that's just happened. So how do you strategically engage both countries as full societies, is something that would be good for us to think about as well, but would be particularly good for you guys to think about.
Yeah, what an incredible. Yeah, that's an incredible set of insights there. I think it is a real rallying call, actually, isn't it? That essentially what you're saying is the ground is fertile, it's good, there's good relationship. It's interesting what you just said about brand. The brand is good. That's something that comes out across a number of different contexts, countries, regions for the UK, but not to take it for granted. It's actually the UK that needs to work on this much harder than the US. But I also love that set of recommendations there about how you could do that. It's there for the taking. But that idea that, a UK leader hasn't spoken directly to the American people in a very high profile way that people remember for a long time. It's a really interesting, that's a really interesting point.
It just occurred to me, but yeah, I can't really think of it, right? Like if you think about it, right, Blair came and gave very noteworthy addresses in the States. And I mean, he made a deliberate point after 9/11 of being at the speech Bush gave to Congress. Obviously, going back even further, Di came to America a lot. I mean, the Queen obviously came to America a lot in a non-political sense. And England is sort of, tons of people like Manchester United or the Beatles. There's tons of things, but and again, I'm sure Cameron and Johnson must have given speeches and the like, but none that I can remember, and I pay attention.
And I think what this is a reminder of is that Britain, as it has gone inward and as it has been inward looking and struggled with this sense of decline, and it is now coming into a new political era and phase, that sense of what's done to repair or what's done to re-enter and strengthen again Britain's presence in the world applies just as much to the US as it does to other parts of the world. And I think that is an excellent reminder as Britain looks at its role in the world going forward.
Yeah, and if I think about it too, correct me if I'm wrong on this too, but I think America plays a larger role in British internal politics, certainly than Britain plays in American politics, right? So if you're the new Labour leader, right, Corbyn was sort of, I don't want to say anti-American, that might be too strong, but, was sort of classically critical of American foreign policy from a hard left position. And, if you're Starmer and you go make a big appeal to America, some people will be like, why are you preferencing America instead of, or Iraq, or, do you want to follow the Americans in the Middle East, or anywhere else, right? In a way that, we won't really open up in American, public debate. No one's going to be like, why are you too close to England? I mean, they might say, why are you spending time on it as opposed to something else? So it gets neglected, but it would never be controversial unless you did something, pledged allegiance to the king, right? And even then people would find it funny. So, I get some of the constraints internally of it too. But I mean, and I think it's a broader feature, right? Like again, I'm looking at this as an outsider, but, I was here in 2012 when the Olympics happened, and it had this feature of sort of modern Britain with James Bond and the Queen. And, it was like if you could set a novel starting in that day, and it was like this re-entry into the world. And then ever since, it's been sort of, one bad thing after another, right? Or, or it hasn't felt kind of in stride. And I think people have a way of picking up on that, because I can think even the leaders that are controversial in the US, right? There is a notion of Trudeau's Canada or of Macron's France among American policy lead, right? And there was a bit of that with Johnson, but sort of on a, there isn't that notion of like, what is England and what does it stand for now? It doesn't have that kind of political brand in the same way. I mean, and Thatcher's England would have had that. Blair's England, certainly Churchill's England would have had that. I mean, that's an extreme situation, but would have had that kind of branding.
Yeah, an amazing invitation to Britain as it goes into the next political era. Ari, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Great British Foreign Affairs podcast, where Britain meets the world. Subscribe today, share it with a friend or colleague, and be part of shaping Britain's role on the global stage.